Welcome to Victor Street Fiction, the podcast dedicated to blending song and story. Every month, I'll read you an original work of fiction, written by me, Adam Pettit. Each episode also features an original score, composed and performed by Aaron Collins. You can find his other projects by following the link in the description. Our mission is to break the barriers of both the album and the audiobook, to treat the story and the score equally, and to blur the lines between what's expected in music and in narrative. Mostly, our mission is to create an enjoyable experience for you. So please, sit back, relax, and get ready. You're on Victor Street. Sundown in America, Part 2. Lynn's tent was up before Walt's, and Elle came down to help him finish. The two tents were about 10 feet apart, and Lynn's was bigger and looked professional, photogenic, like an advertisement. Walt's looked wrinkled, like it needed to be ironed, and the loops kept slipping out from the supporting poles, bringing the whole dome collapsing inward. But, with Elle's assistance, the tent was finally raised, and they walked together up the hill to retrieve some linens from the car. On the way, they heard a forced, falsely amiable voice, and once over the apex, they found Lynn, standing by the beaten golf cart with Gary. He'd attached a little trailer to it, and had filled the trailer with wood. "About time," said Gary, arms akimbo. "That must be a record. Longest tent pitching in history. I watched you from up here, struggling." Gary's smile publicized Walt's ineptitude more than his throat, and Walt walked past, saying, "I don't camp often, no. And this isn't my tent." "You need an instruction manual?" asked Gary, reaching into the mini trailer and tossing out a few stumps and planks. A small banged-up fire ring had already been thrown onto the ground and a spot burned away, black and yellow, where the surrounding grass was dead. "I don't suppose you know how to build a fire either," he said. "Don't worry. I'll do it for you if you want." "That'd be great," said Lynn. "We could use the help." "Do you have any lighter fluid?" asked Walt, searching around in Gary's cart. "Lighter fluid? Shit, boy. You'd ruin the fire then. It's got to smell clean." He broke a board of the yellow-red wood over his knee and tossed the split pieces beside the rusted ring. Elle came from the car with a pile of blankets and asked Walt for assistance. He took a portion, and then they walked together down the hill toward the tent. "He doesn't seem to like you," she said, once they were out of earshot. "Nobody seems to like me very much these days," Walt replied. Elle dipped her face down, resting her nose in the soft blanket bunched up in her arms. She took in the fresh, chemical scent of the laundry detergent, hiding in the fibers. He's everything you hate, she said, returning. Country boy, race car jacket, insensitive, assumed ignorant. But so far, he's already proven useful and polite. Polite to you, said Walt. He expects there's an off chance he'll sweep you off your feet. Elle didn't argue. You came rolling up here with 2 girls. Aside from his mother, I doubt any woman's ever let him be in a car with her for more than 30 seconds. He doesn't know who you are, or where you've been. You come from a different world than he did. You're unpredictable. He doesn't know how to read you, except as another bull in his way, a competition. He's threatened by you. I wish he'd leave us alone, said Walt, glancing over his shoulder. I'm not a bull, and I don't like trouble. I hope he goes back home as soon as that fire's up. I think he's going to try and stay a while, said Elle, looking back with Walt. You don't need to be a psychic to know what's on his mind. We're not losing him tonight. They organized their tent, made it as homey as possible, and when they went back up the hillside, they saw that Gary already had a small fire of kindling and newspaper going. The night, as Lynn had predicted, was falling fast, and the rest of the logs had been unloaded from the trailer and were strewn in unorganized stacks on the ground nearby. Do you know what kind of wood this is? Asked Gary, once Walt and Elle were settled, standing beside the fire. Nobody knew the answer, although the smell was familiar and pleasant. Of course you wouldn't know, said Gary. It's cedar wood. The Indians around here used to burn it in ceremonies. The sparks that rise can be read for symbols of the future. The sparks are the voice of the ancients, the deceased, speaking to the living. And thick orange sparks were surging, like Chinese lanterns, high into the darkening night. The wood burns too quickly to use for long, though. That's why I also brought some common maple. I'll add that on once the fire starts to go out, and then it should burn for quite a long time. Elle crossed arms with Lynn, and Walt remained in place near Gary. He admired the cedar's reaction to the heat, and meditated on the Native American tradition, which may or may not have been true. While his mind was on the topic of mysticism, Walt decided to probe Gary with internal judgment to extract what essence he could sense about the man's character. Without looking at him, without speaking, Walt imagined giving Gary waves of psychic pleasantry, blue lines that undulated from his brain into his new acquaintances. Walt hoped that the mental flow would be accepted, and he watched from inside his head and out as Gary closed off and turned away. The man would do no business with Walt. While others sometimes accepted the flow and gave back, Gary seemed enraged about the prospect, like he understood what Walt was imagining, and there would be no peace between them. Gary surrounded his skull with high defensive barriers, walls to sever trade. If he had anything to share, it would be with the women, and even then, that kindness would not be a true kindness, but a deception, a lure to quick intimacy, a default set in Gary's character, down at his basic core. Whether using this plane of intuition to test another's character is reliable or fair is one argument, thought Walt. Sure, but intuition drives real actions between others, perhaps more than vocal conversation in most events. as it's close to impossible to convert someone who's made up their mind about one side of an argument. And the deep coldness, the deep unwelcoming that Walt felt inside of Gary now, showed him that there was nothing he wished to extract from this man, and there was nothing he could give to Gary that Gary wouldn't waste or find unneeded and ridiculous. Gary was closed off, and Walt felt this closure, and he backed away from this mocking, overly self-assured, dangerous first impression. Gary departed with a grunt and pulled a few folding chairs out from the golf cart. He carried them over and placed them around the fire. "How many of you were there?" he asked, sipping around with his pointer and pinky finger, counting. "There aren't 4 of you?" "It's very obvious," said Walt, "that there are 3 of us." Said Gary. "I could have sworn there were 4 of you. 3 ladies and 1 gentleman. I brought 4 chairs." "Well, you're very welcome to sit with us a bit and enjoy the fire," invited Lynn. "That's polite of you," he said. "I don't want to crash your party, but if we have enough chairs out here, then I don't see why they shouldn't be used." "You can use my chair," said Walt. "I'm not going to stay up much later, especially if we're still aiming to leave around 6 tomorrow." Gary situated the chairs so there was a gap where the smoke tended to billow. 2 chairs were on the northern side of the circle, and 2 were on the southern. Gary was the first to sit down, and the others followed as a unit. Elle took a seat next to Walt, and Lynn took a seat next to Gary on the other side, almost another continent away. "I think it'll be a good night tonight," said Gary, looking up to the heavens. "It's a shame you have to waste it by turning off and going to sleep so early." "I've seen many beautiful nights," said Walt. "I have more important things in my mind right now than one beautiful night. It can be sacrificed for the greater good." "Nothing is more important than a beautiful night," said Gary, and then nudging Lynn with his elbow. "Except maybe a beautiful girl." "If I get this job," said Walt, "it'll mean a lot of great things for us in the future." "Well, if that's the case," said Gary, "I wish you luck. Is your interview tomorrow? You're a far distance away if it is." 3 days, said Walt. "And you're resting now?" Fireflies were glowing in the field, like stars bursting forward into existence, and then simmering out, energy cut. Walt saw that Elle was watching them in the mesmeric way that she often watched creatures of the hidden world, and he wondered what she was thinking about them. From another perspective of time, if the life of the stars appeared so fast and distant, like the fireflies, like if the night were the universe and the flies were the stars, how quickly lived would our small human lives be lived? "We used to call them lightning bugs," said Elle, "in the South. I went to the Smokies with my family a few years ago. Every summer, the fireflies gather there and synchronize their lights. You stand in the middle of the forest, and in the dark, the lights come on all at once, far away from you. They'll go out, and immediately, more take over, closer. Those live, alight, go out, and the next wave comes, closer and then closer. Finally, you're surrounded on all sides by 1,000 glowing lights, and they hover and bob like magical spells around you. They go out all at once, and then the woods behind you glow, and it keeps going down the line, all the way to the end. And once the lights go out at the end of the forest, They come on again in the front, and they sweep closer and closer to you like before, lights off and on, surrounding you and leaving, holding you, and then letting go. I really can't comprehend it. From above, it must look like a brainwave on a monitor. All the fireflies know, instinctually, when to ignite. They contain more within them than we can even know. She looked into the fire and imagined faces that as a child she claimed she could see in the flames. The woman who found them kept the season a secret for over 50 years. Once she grew old and realized that she may not live much longer, she told a friend for the first time one of the strangest things in nature that she'd ever seen. I like to imagine her walking out into the forest every year alone, surrounded by the secret of the fireflies. Just her, surrounded by their pulsing light. Gary held up his hand. An orator. The strangest thing I've seen in nature, he said, are people. You think fireflies are smart? Well, they've got nothing on people. Most people would probably agree that humans are smarter than fireflies. Yes, said Walt. But I think that's missing her point. You folks are going to the city tomorrow, said Gary. You call that nature, right? Sure, some people might say the city is everything that nature isn't. And when they leave the city, they're leaving to get back into nature. But I say, why keep them separate? Town and country. You would call termite mound a part of nature, but the termites might call it their city. We're animals too, using bits of the ground to put up walls and houses and roads, beaver dams. The moon was rising higher, and the sky was turning a strange torn auburn, dynamic across the velvet horizon. Gary slapped his leg. The fire always makes people talk the same sort of talk, don't you think? It opens up channels in the mind. You kids want a drink? Might make the talk a little better. I brought some sangria up with me. You brought sangria? asked Lynn. On the back of the golf cart was strapped a small container, like an unplugged icebox. Opening it, Gary rooted around to the bottom of various spider-covered objects until he came to a magnum-sized bottle of a well-known and often avoided $3 wine. With the other hand, he removed an unopened bottle of vodka, set it down, and removed a party-sized package of clear plastic cups. He returned to the fire, bearing all of these items, and distributed cups to Elle and then to Walt. He untwisted the cap from the bottle of wine and poured for both of them, and then reached for the vodka, which he'd set on the ground. It's fine, said Walt. I'll just take the wine. You'll just take the wine? He asked. Well, that won't get you anywhere. Same for me, said Elle. He looked at the two like ungrateful dinner party guests, and then he took his collection over to Lynn's side. Well, I know that somebody over here will join me. Only a tad, cringed Lynn. I probably don't need as much as you do. You do want some of the real stuff? He asked, holding up the vodka so the contents sloshed and made a jugging sound under the neck. Well, it wouldn't be sangria without it, now would it? She asked. He gave her a large splash, a splash that most might deem a heavy-handed pour, diluting the deep dyed color of the wine. Gary took a seat in his chair, and once settled, he filled his glass to the brim, mostly with vodka. "You go on a lot of trips with your family?" he asked Elle. "You seem like you have some camping know-how." She smiled politely and nodded. "Yes, we used to go on quite a few trips, growing up. The Grand Canyon, Joshua Tree, Jasper, the Willamette Valley. I've not been on nearly as many trips as Lynn, though. She grew up traveling the countryside." Gary was draining his glass, so he didn't stop Elle to change the subject to Lynn, as Walt felt he wanted to do. "My parents used to meet nearby here in Du Bois when they were dating. It was the halfway point between Long Island, where my dad lived, and where my mom grew up in Kentucky. Since we're traveling this way, and Lynn wanted to camp, I thought it would be nice to stay in Du Bois like my parents used to. Kind of bring my life full circle and see a bit of my roots." Gary swallowed hard, and then shook the shock of the drink away from him. "This isn't Du Bois," he croaked. "That's still another 20-30 minutes away." "We thought it would be close enough," interrupted Lynn. "There was traffic on the interstate, and it was no use to go any further just to sit still." "You made a wise decision," he saluted. "You'll see once you're in Du Bois, it's just like anywhere else up and down the road. Franchises, parking lots, and malls. At least you have a nice view of the country from up here. In the morning, if it's clear, I'll lend you some binoculars, and you can try to see the edge of Du Bois. You may have to stand up on that rock over there, maybe prop one of these chairs on the rock." The view now, Walt noticed, was of darkness, and only darkness. He listened to the hoot of owls, and wondered how he'd missed the color's departure. "My parents like Du Bois," said Elle. "It holds a place in their hearts. They talk about it like a dream." "A dream?" huffed Gary, coughing up spittle. "I guess different places mean different things to different people. You'll see it tomorrow. There's nothing there. Nothing exciting. Well, it never excited me much, really. It's just another place to buy lumber and ammo." He looked at Lynn too long and smiled with darkened teeth. "Don't you all think it's a little quiet out here? Maybe we could liven this party up." "How so?" "The radio," he said. "You think we could turn on your car radio?" "I suppose so," she said. "What would you like to listen to?" "Right now," he said. "Classic rock, but in the daytime only country." She rose and went to the car. She turned the key backward and twisted up the volume knob. All that increased was the boiling sound of static. She changed the channels, uncovering new styles of fuzz, some quiet and muted, and others aggressive, like hands tearing paper. Gary refilled his glass with more vodka. Walt and Elle had both only pretended to take a sip, out of courtesy, and placed their cups on the ground. Each eyed their wine, and each eyed each other. "You'd think that up here we'd get channels as clear as day. Try 88.9, said Gary. "I passed it already," said Lynn. "I don't think anything is clear." "I have some songs on my phone," offered Walt. "We could plug that in. No classic rock or country, though." "What you got?" asked Gary. "Local bands from back home. Lately all I listen to are bands that my friends are in." "Nothing else?" asked Gary. "It's the culture," said Walt. "Why would I listen to what big money wants me to hear, just so I can fill their wallets more, when I have a community all around me making music that I can relate to on a personal level? I know the musicians, and we go through the same things." "Plug it in," said Gary. "Let's see how good your friends are." "I don't think you're gonna like it," said Elle. But Walt brought his phone to Lynn, who plugged it into the car. "What would you say this music's like?" asked Gary. "Is it loud?" "I would call it art loud," said Elle. The music blasted in over the speakers, colorful and energetic, and when Lynn and Walt sat down in their seats, they found that a new tension had grown. "I hate being the DJ," Walt admitted. "Introducing new music to people always leaves me a little nerve-wracked. Your choice of song reveals who you are as much as the melody reveals the songwriter." "I can see why you like the music," Gary nodded. "But it's garbage. It's like zombies throwing paint onto a crowd," Lynn defended calmly. "The band finds cohesion by exploring new paths to follow, like trailblazers. They use more variation than the usual formula you might hear in radio hits. I've always liked this band, but maybe you'd have to see them live to get it. Or maybe you'd have to know them like we do." "You sound like a deadhead," grunted Gary. "You can't defend bad music when it's playing right beside me and I can hear it. Can you turn it down?" "You can leave it on, but turn it down." Offended, Lynn stood and returned to the nearby car. "I didn't think it was that loud." Gary gargled down more of his sangria and chuckled at an unknown joke in his drink. The music played on, quieter. Lynn left it at a reasonable volume, so it was in the background, but not inaudible. The driver's door was open to allow the sound to pass through, and sitting by the fire, with the car radio supplying the soundtrack of the night, Walt smiled for the first time since they'd left that afternoon. On a voyage out of town, what had calmed him most were reminders of home. Celebratory shouts were heard out in the wilderness, firecrackers or gunshots, dogs barking. "Is that from the town that we passed earlier in the trees?" asked Lynn. "Perhaps they can hear the music," said Gary. He read the concerned look on Lynn's face. "Don't worry," he said. "They'll leave you three alone. They usually leave campers alone, as long as no one wanders onto their turf at night. I drove you through so they know not to come up here, to tell them that the field is occupied. No, if I were you, I'd be more afraid of the bears." He took another head-tilted drink, unable to sip. He gasped and wiped his mouth, straining for air, red stains on his lips and teeth. "They sound like ghouls to me." He gazed around at the group, a storyteller's look about him. "You kids believe in spirits?" "It's fun," said Lynn, "to believe around a campfire." "The spirits follow fire," said Gary. "They're drawn to it from another world. We've always called them the fireside wolves, the spirits, because they lurk around the ring and come out to live again through people's speech. You can't help but tell your tales around a fire, can't you?" Walt and Elle, with their heads down now, avoided eye contact with the other side of the smoke. To get their attention, Gary spoke up louder and deeper than he'd spoken throughout the night. "When you've lived here as long as I have, with the days spent outdoors, you come to see things. And not just once, I've seen things many times. The dead do often revisit the living." Unprovoked by his audience, he continued, "An old friend of mine, Randy Ryder, was killed in the Vietnam War. We served there together, back when I was younger than you are now. I survived, but Randy wasn't so lucky. He didn't come back home. At least not his body. A young girl went missing in these woods about 10 years ago. She'd come with her daddy in the RV lot, and the last anybody had seen her, she was playing near the edge of the wood. We had search parties going out, dogs, police, everyone, right here gathered up in this field as home base. Sheriff Jackson came to me, put his hands on my shoulder, and said, "Gary, no one knows these woods as well as you. Will you lead this search party?" And I was a little shy, and I said, "Okay, Sheriff, you're right about one thing there. Nobody knows these woods as well as me. I'll find this little girl." So there was pressure on me, a great pressure. This poor little girl was lost out here, maybe injured. Her mother was in tears, crying for the whole day, the RV lot. But we went out there, and I had all these guys following me, fanned out in all directions. We had dogs rushing out. It was just like in a movie. We went everywhere I thought the girl could go, and further. I checked in all the caves. I checked all the cliffs to see if she fell from any. Nothing. We couldn't find a single trace, not even a torn piece of clothing, not even a footprint. It was like she'd vanished. After a few days, everyone had given up and gone home. Even the girl's parents had lost hope and left. But I kept looking. You see, I had a feeling that she was out there. And I don't think she'd been kidnapped or killed. I thought she was out there somewhere where the dogs couldn't smell her. So, like we're doing now, right here in this field, I burned cedar. And I looked into the sparks for guidance. I prayed to God for a clue, for a sign. And instead of an Indian spirit, I saw Randy, young as the day he died. And he told me, "Gary, you've got to get that girl right now. She's hurt. She can't move. She's starving. And she's going to die if you can't find her in the next few hours." I said, "Randy, it's midnight. I can't see anything. I've looked everywhere around here. I just don't know where she is." Then Randy's ghost came out of the fire here, like a hologram, wearing his boots and camo, and he waved his arm and said, "Come here, follow me." So I followed him out into the woods there, and not so far from where you're camping, but very far from where she started her journey. I found her beneath a felled tree with a broken leg, bones sticking black out of the skin. I don't know how that tree managed to fall on her, but that's what happened, and for some reason, the dogs never found her. But I think the dogs never found her so Randy could come back. He could come back to show me that there is life after death, and that even the dead have concern for the living. He closed his story by draining his cup and then filling it up with more vodka, dipping the bottle too far into his drink, and splashing some on his sleeve. Randy came back to me another time. This time, my good friend Phil was dying of cancer, and I'd forgotten all about how Randy had come to me when the little girl was trapped under that tree. You see, these miracles happen to let us know that everything is going to be okay in the end, but we forget, especially when things don't seem to be going the right way in our lives. Phil was dying, and I couldn't believe it. I wasn't ready for him to die, and I was at the hospital, and he took my hand and said, "Gary, you've been like a brother to me, and really, you are the best friend I ever could have asked for." And I went into the other room, and I thought about shooting myself. I always carry a gun on me, everywhere I go. I think you'd have to be some kind of idiot not to. But that's the only time I ever thought to turn it on myself. I'd lost all faith in Jesus. I'd lost all heart and sense of purpose. My life hadn't turned out how I thought I'd turn out at all. So I pointed the gun at my face. I put the barrel in my mouth. And then Randy stood there right beside me, and he tapped me on the shoulder. He said, Gary, you don't want to do that. It's not your time yet. You still got a lot to do in this life. and your mama needs you. You don't want to leave your mama behind, do you? So I took the gun out of my mouth. And then I saw Phil standing beside Randy, and they were smiling, and they shook my hand and said they'd see me another time in the future. And then I saw the great white light, and then they both had angel wings. They walked off into the shining horizon, off to paradise. When I came back into the hospital room, everyone was crying because Phil had died when I was gone. And people like Sheriff Jackson told me that I'd missed his death, and I should have been there when he died. But I told them, no, I saw him. When I was in the bathroom, he came to me and told me he was better than he was before, that everything was going to be all right. The sheriff asked me what time I'd talked to Phil, and I told him precisely at 6:15. You see, I always have this watch on me, and I check it all the time. And the doctor said, damn, Gary, that was the time of death. So the first thing my good friend did after he died was save me from making a stupid mistake. I've never forgotten about the spirits since. They're out there, man, and they'll come for you if you open your heart. After his story, he burped, and then there was silence, except for the crackling fire. Elle looked at Walt, and Walt looked at Elle. Lynn looked at the ground. Gary got up, taking the bottles with him, and he set them on the picnic table. He tossed the log of maple into the fire, kicked it around with a steel toe, and sent up sparks from the breathing embers. My grandfather fought in Vietnam, said Lynn, trying to contribute. He has some incredible stories, but he doesn't like to tell them. As he shouldn't, said Gary, ambling back to his seat. It's not something that people who live through it like to remember. We were in a haunted house one Halloween, she recalled. You know, those places where people dress up like ghosts or famous scary movie monsters. And we were walking through a red hallway with a lot of doors and terrible people stalking around, jumping out, making noises. My grandfather looked at me and said, Lynn, do you know what this is supposed to be? And I said, no, what, Grandpa? He said, hell. It's supposed to be hell. I know because I've been there. And the only thing I can think he could be referring to is the war. It was hell, agreed Gary. For many. Then they treated us like animals when we came back. It's a story often told. Walt raised his head. Lynn, he said, do you think the radio is draining the battery on your car? I think it'll be fine, said Gary. I know cars, and the radio doesn't take that much juice. What about the lights? Her door's open. Nah, should last for a few hours, he said. I was supposed to have a date tonight. You know that? Girl comes over here sometimes and we have supper together. She works in a diner down near Du Bois. She used to be married to this guy, Lenny, but he went to jail for robbing a TV, so she left him. Now she comes to see me. Why didn't she come out to see you tonight? Asked Lynn, quietly. I don't know what the deal is, slumped Gary. I kissed her last week, and then she left the house in a rush, and I haven't spoken to her since then. You haven't spoken to her in a week, but she was supposed to go on a date with you tonight? I'd already asked her before I kissed her, and she said yes then. But I've called her and left messages on her machine since, and she's never gotten back to me. So I expect I shouldn't expect her. She's just a loudmouth bitch anyway. Walt leaned over to Elle and whispered, Is it making you uncomfortable, the way he's looking at her? Elle positioned her mouth closer to Walt's ear, in a sneaky, head-tilted way, so the other side of the fire wouldn't notice. It's unnerving, she said. We need to end this soon. Darling, demanded Gary, I don't know what the hell I was thinking, bringing those bottles to the picnic table. Make me a sangria, won't you? Obedient, Lynn took his glass and stood. She showed no shame or unnaturalness pouring more vodka and wine for this man, even in front of her friend. Gary's eyes, all the while, remained pressed against Lynn's ass. Even when Elle gave him the stern and protective stare of a good friend defending, he didn't look away. He observed with privilege, hypnotized and feasting, deserving. And Lynn didn't notice or show signs of noticing, even when Walt cleared his throat. Asleep through the storm. Lynn filled up a small glass for herself and noticed that the magnum of wine was almost empty already. She gave the bottle a swirl. It's okay, said Gary. There's another in the cart. We can go all night if we want to. I always keep a stockpile of booze at home, just over there. He pointed to his house again, as if he hadn't already pointed to his house 100 times. I don't know if we're going to make it all night, said Walt. We have to get up early in the morning tomorrow, remember? Gary threw his arm out to shoo Walt. We're already well on our way, and there's no getting off this train once it leaves the station. Lynn returned with his drink, and he patted her on that gene-framed obsession which had filled his world for the last minute or so, and she didn't seem offended. He's just an old man, her face seemed to say. Is she into it? Wondered Walt. Is she into being harassed like this? She isn't rebelling at all. If anything, she's scooting closer, being drawn in by his drunken dominion. No, Elle's gaze told him. I've seen this before. This is her natural defensive response. She'd rather see him happy than upset, and she's doing this to save the situation, to prevent the scene. I'm seeing major flaws in this tactic, Walt stared. This cannot escalate much further. Doesn't he know he's in the wrong? When Vietnam ended, said Gary, closed off, and everyone was being shipped back home, it was my job to kill the dogs. He sat up straight in his seat with pride. You may call me heartless, but that's why they asked me to do it. These dogs were trained to kill. They couldn't continue living. They were dangerous weapons. So we took them all behind a hangar, lined them up. They gave me a pistol, and I popped them off one by one. The dogs were extraordinarily well behaved. We asked them to sit, and they didn't so much as bark at hearing the bullets. Maybe they were used to the guns, having spent all their lives in the war. He chuckled softly and looked around, over his head and down at his feet. So many stories to tell about this place, he said. We once had a music festival with Seattle grunge bands. All these kids smoking drugs. Their music was kind of like the music you're playing here, only theirs was better. They had a light show, fire spinners, fog machines. I'm good friends with the sheriff, and he helped us monitor it, keep it legal. But we had all kinds of kids like you coming out here and enjoying the property. Must have been about 15 years ago now. I don't know many of those people anymore. I don't know where they've gone to, what's become of them. It seems to me that everybody leaves at some time or another. Your life will be one way, and then it'll change, and never go back to what it was. There was this time we had this Japanese man come and visit, and he went hiking in these woods, off on his own. Now, I'm warning you, don't ever go hiking in these woods all on your own, not unless you're looking to get lost, or attacked by bears. If you do go hiking tomorrow, bring a gun with you. The stupidest thing is to ever leave home without a gun. Well, his Japanese guy went out hiking without a gun, and he disappeared. and we had to form a search party. We got all these police out here, and we all met right here in this field, and I marched a whole line of people out into these woods. The dogs couldn't find this guy, and the sheriff gave up, and the party all left after 2 days of searching. But I knew he was out there, so I went out one night with my flashlight, and I was digging around some areas that we'd missed, and damn it if I didn't find him. He was howling like a wolf because some large animal had chased him off the trail and bit his leg. I couldn't understand much of what he's saying. He was Japanese, but I picked him up and carried him back to my house. Mama called the police, and Sheriff Jackson told me I was a hero, and the doctor said I'd saved his life. The bite might have become infected on his leg without me to bring him back in time and give him hydrogen peroxide. They weren't even sure what kind of bite it was from, and he described a large animal with red eyes that I'd never seen before. Red eyes, we called the beast. It's out there. We don't know everything that's out there in these woods, you know. There are many mysteries surrounding us, just like red eyes. And then that girl, Lenny's old girl, was here, and she was cooking for me and Mama, and we kept hearing noises out in the trees. And I kept thinking of red eyes, and all those kids smoking drugs up here under that big circus tent, reading my poems and telling me that I'd only lived to 80 years old. And I wondered if it's all connected. Everything's all connected, you see. You tired? Asked Walt. Elle nodded. Walt stood. And I thought about Randy with the angel wings when I was out with Lenny's girl back here in the field looking for the creature. I told her how I saw the angel wings on her already. Thank you for the fire and for the stories, said Walt. But it's time for Elle and I to turn in for the night. Gary's face sealed up tight, like cork. You guys are closing out? Yeah, said Walt. I'm feeling beat. You haven't touched your drinks, he said. Are you not having a good time? No, said Walt. We're having a wonderful time, but it's late, and it's time for us to go to bed. Lynn stood as well. It has been nice, Mr. Gary. We really appreciate all that you've done for us. I'm not ready to go in yet, he said, sternly towards Walt, and then betrayed toward Lynn. That's fine, she said. You can ride the fire out. Yeah, he said, looking lost, defeated, deflated and distant. I'll just stay for another drink or two. Good night, nodded Walt. And he caught up with Elle, who'd already begun her descent down the hill toward the tents, avoiding any phatic contact with Gary. Lynn took the keys from the ignition, shutting off the background music, and the car lights went out once she closed the door. Thank you, she waved. It really was the nicest time. Good night. Her feet clomped down the hill, where the bending grass collected dew. In the tent, Walt could feel every rock beneath his back. Elle was sprawled away from him, only her wrists touching his wrists. I still hear him there, she said. How long has it been now? Over 45 minutes, said Walt. So much for getting any sleep tonight. I can't sleep with a maniac like him out there. He's talking to himself. What do you think he's saying? Asked Elle. They were both silent for a moment, listening for any audible word in the angry mush. The only definite words being when Gary sped out an aggressive "fucking," followed by several metered mumbles, and then another sharp spit of "Jesus." After a soft rumble that could have been his volcanic belly, he chanted, "Heroes, heroes," several times in echo. Do you think that Lynn's awake? Asked Elle. I don't see how she couldn't be, said Walt. How could anybody sleep? We're defenseless here. He says he's got a gun. He said it several times. He's just a drunk old man, said Walt. He'll either pass out soon or go away. They heard louder.
I'll die.
Why did Lynn let him treat her like that? Asked Walt. You saw that, right? He stared at her like a stripper, and then he smacked her ass. There's no other way to put it. That's her way of dealing with the situation, Elle said. I wouldn't have acted that way, and I know you wouldn't have acted that way if you were in her shoes, but that's how she deals with things. It's like she was completely unaware that anything was wrong, said Walt. Am I the crazy one here? Do you think that I'm mistaken, being alarmed like I am? No, said Elle. I think this has turned into a bad situation. Unnecessary kindness to strangers, heaved Walt. Here's to being in the right and to being in the wrong. If we told him to get lost right up front, maybe he wouldn't have stayed. Or maybe he would have snuck up on us in the night, murdered you, and raped us, said Elle. You never know how things are going to go down. At least now we know that he has problems, and to be on our guard. At least now we know where he is outside. We have the upper hand. They heard Gary grumble. Next time we're staying in a hotel, said Walt. The reason we haven't heard from Lynn, and the reason we're still pretending to be asleep out here, is because she doesn't want to be blamed for this. Why should she be blamed for this? She's the one who wanted to go camping. It's not like she could have predicted that things would come to this. Nobody could. You could equally be blamed for this, for inviting her, said Walt. I would have never have come here if I were calling the shots. I prevent things like this from happening by actively avoiding them in the first place. This isn't my fault, she cried. I lose a little work, said Walt. I fall a little out of style, and suddenly you're weeping for no reason. You exclude me from everything that you do. The apartment feels like I don't belong there, like I'm an intruder. You've lost all faith in me, and now I have no say in anything. I can't even veto camping. You're aggravated and taking your paranoid daydreams too far, like you always do, she growled. And why shouldn't I take my thoughts too far, he asked. Envisioning dangerous scenarios is how I protect myself. Am I not allowed to say what I feel? Am I not allowed to say what we choose not to say? Because we might be too afraid of the repercussions? I'm in a bad place, and I've got to get out of it. I want to get us back to the city. We never should have left it. Since we've been home, I've had no power. And now, when trying to get that power back, when trying to return us to our full capacity, you invite her to come out here with us. She's always in the way. She's always between us. I pretend like she's a friend, but she isn't my friend. She's trying to remove me from your life. I'd go as far as to say that she wants to take my place, or are you as oblivious to that as she is to Gary's eyes? Elle turned her head toward the corner of the tent, her face against the cold plastic tarp beneath them. This hasn't been a very nice trip, she said. I thought it would be great with you and my friend in New York. Every truth has to surface sometime, said Walt. And for months now, I've felt diminished from your life. He turned his head to the other side, his feet becoming cold under the heavy, damp blankets. Once a couple brings up the very idea of breaking up, I feel like that's the end of it. We've been battling it out, but it's been very difficult for us, very difficult. Life shouldn't feel so choked shut, so damned. They were quiet under the covers, cold and magmic, a polycephalic organism looking at the world in opposite directions. A loud switch shot through the night, and a bright light shone onto their tent, exposing their silhouettes to any outside observer. As they scrambled in their small quarters, trying to make sense of what was happening, Gary let out a loud "woo!" as harsh as his throat could muster. The golf cart was parked now at the top of the hill, and the searchlight was on at full power, aimed directly at their tent. "What do we do?" cried Elle, hysterical. Walt grabbed her hand, and they laid down still, playing Possum Dead. Gary called out an incomprehensible mess of shouts and slurs. Then they heard the clang of a metal pipe against the side of the golf cart, sending echoes far into the valley.
Get out of here, Bears! Get out of here!
Elle hid her face in Walt's arm, and they laid there, tense beneath the covers. They laid there until they heard the engine start back up. Gary placed the golf cart in reverse, and the shouts and clanging of his pipe faded off into the distance. Walt unzipped the tent, putting on his pants as he went, and reaching for his glasses in a pouch at the side, he hobbled barefoot out into the forest. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "We've got to fool him," he said. "If he comes back and thinks we're still in the tent, I'll hit him with a rock from behind." Walt went down to the creek bed, and not seeing the water, wound up ankle-deep in it. The cold was jarring to him, and he reached his hands down into the clear stream, finding a large, smooth oval. Elle withdrew back into the tent and zipped it closed, and Walt wandered into the trees, following the creek line, but keeping the tent and the hillside in sight. Coming up the hill, Walt saw the searchlight darting across the night, competing with the moon. Gary's hollers reverberated nearer. Walt gripped the brick-sized stone tighter in his hand and looked at its blue color and imagined that this stone could soon be stained dark with wine, and in this moment, he felt joy in the necessity of his role as a protector. He felt brave for having left the tent with his plan to ambush the drunk. He hoped Gary would stay away, but no. If Gary came back around, he hoped it would escalate to a marriage between the stone and Gary's skull. These murderous impulses, perhaps they are always there, and one wishes secretly for situations of violence to arise, so one can act without thought, primal and base. Walt understood with clarity how all the prior events in his life, and all of those before his life, had led him to this: his downfall, his unemployment, Elle's growing distrust, her parents, and where they liked to meet on the weekends. All of it had led him here to strike a man down, to end what he despised. The golf cart did come back around, and Walt hid behind a tree, which, like others on the periphery, was thin, none of this being old growth. Gary flung his arms around and screamed like a cowboy on a bull. The golf cart swayed back and forth, and he drove it hard, perhaps wanting to flip it, wanting it to crush him and end him. But the golf cart didn't flip. He drove it to the edge of the hill again, parked it, and reached up over the roof again to point the searchlight down onto the tent. He screamed and shouted like a jackal, like a coyote, and Walt walked forward, unhidden by the trees, rock in hand. Gary hopped out of the cart and swung his metal pipe against the frame several times like a lumberjack, or like a medieval beheader, armed with an axe, chopping down. But even in his frenzy, he heard Walt, with gravel underfoot, and he turned the light on its lazy Susan around to blind the intruder. The light stretched all colors into one, and Walt shielded his eyes with his arm. With what vision was available, he saw Gary swinging the pipe at the empty bottles on the picnic table, shattering one into the fire, where the embers were still cooking strong. Walt didn't slow his approach, and he stepped forward. "The hero, Beowulf," said Gary. "Look now at the hero," defended the women. "But you weren't there. You weren't in the war. If you had been, then you would know. All the men who act like heroes wind up dead. All the heroes died. I knew many heroes, and they're all dead. Even Phil. He was a hero, and he died." Walt didn't slow. "Gary, we're trying to sleep. Look at the hero, said Gary, coming forward like he's not afraid. I can see you shaking. You know what happens to heroes? Gary, Walt strode on, knuckles popping over the stone in hand. We're just trying to camp for one night. We paid you to stay here. And in the morning, we're gonna go away. You wouldn't be scared if you were a believer, said Gary, turning to face Walt fully. I saw your face earlier. You aren't a believer. You'll go to hell when you die. You think there's nothing up there. You think there's nothing after this. But you're wrong. I've seen it. That's why I'm not afraid. That's why you're afraid. And that's why I'm not afraid. Gary dropped his metal pipe and stepped forward. I'm not afraid. Walt heard the zipper open on his tent, and Elle came out to see them. The men were close on the hill now, both stepping with caution toward each other. Their faces were hidden by spider-leg tree branches, blackened cracks in the sky beyond. Gary, said Walt, I'm telling you now to go home. I am home, said Gary. He looked down at Elle and shouted, Here's your hero. Don't you feel safe now? Gary stared Walt down, all the arteries in his eyes pumping thick to capacity, breath heaving through his clomped teeth. He raised his arms above his head. Walt held his arms out to show he had no weapons, and that he'd come in peace. But the rock in his hand destroyed that facade, and he didn't let it go. Gary, be quiet, turn your light off, and go to sleep. I'm doing you a favor, hero, he breathed. I was scaring away the bears. You do know that there are bears around here, don't you? I'm not afraid of bears, said Walt. You should be afraid of the bears, said Gary, closing in. Don't you know what a bear can do to you? He clasped his hands around Walt's throat, and over Elle's scream, and Gary's closing pupils. Walt felt for the first time in his life how a pair of hands felt around his throat, with intent to kill. But through this contact, Walt felt that the weakness of the man had been made weaker by the drink, and it wasn't difficult to brush the hands away like feathers. He dropped the rock onto the ground and shoved Gary only hard enough to clear him of his space. Get out of here, commanded Walt. And in shame, Gary stumbled around until he found the picnic table. He put both hands on the table, shaking it, and knocked the remaining bottle off. Get away from us. Walt turned his back and walked to the tents, tall, and without fear of an assault from behind. Still, he kept his senses sharp and listened for the clumsy sound of Gary reaching for his gun. He ran through the scenario in his brain, imagined the bullet tearing through the bone beside his ear. But Gary didn't reach for the gun. Instead, he wailed like the ghouls he wished to become. A ghost story. One of the fireside wolves. And he flipped the picnic table into the fire and shouted his way back to the golf cart, moaning. His fun and disjointed screams had become sad and lonesome, indignant banshee howls, and he drove off again to the other portion of the field, his searchlight fixed on the shining stars. Once Walt reached the darkness of the wood, and he knew Gary's eyes were off of him, he ran to the tent, where Elle jumped into his arms. Let's get out of here, said Walt, quivering. And Elle ran over to Lynn's tent, calling her name. Lynn, Lynn. She shook the tent and unzipped it herself. Lynn, we've got to get out of here. We're leaving. Lynn rubbed the sleep out of her eyes. What time is it? Time to go, said Elle. He tried to strangle Walt. Walt didn't deassemble the tent. He and Elle grabbed their blankets and they left for the car. Lynn, without context, who had not woken during the scuffle, turned on her flashlight, put her clothes on slowly, rolled up her sleeping bag, and then folded her tent. Up the hill, Walt found that the car was locked. Erratic, he and Elle flipped the handle and shouted for Lynn to hurry. And over the hill, the maniacal golf cart driver wound closer, yelling joyfully again, as though he'd forgotten what he'd recently been through, or had decided to stop caring about it, but knew, somewhere deep down, that he had to get revenge, that it would be fun to destroy something else, anything, again. "You left your tent behind," Lynn said, coming up the hill. And if it had only been Walt alone who'd been acting crazy, perhaps she would have come up the hill slower still. She unlocked the door with the fob, and Elle and Walt dove in. The searchlight grew bigger, the cart coming closer, and they felt the trunk open. "The trunk!" squealed Walt. He looked out the back window, where he could see a sleepy Lynn tucking her tent away snugly into its allotted port. Take a hint from the immediacy here. Elle kicked the door open and shouted, "Lynn, get in the car. We've got to go." "What's the big rush?" she asked, dropping into the driver's seat, annoyed. The golf cart came close and tried to chase down the car, but after they pulled away, Walt watched Gary circle around in his yard, a loop of lone insanity, howling. Lynn drove back the way they'd entered and made it to the forest trail. The forest was dark, and the headlights diffused against a strand of mist hovering off the ground. And Lynn tried to remember, calculating. It was a right turn here, and a little dip here. "I remember that tree with all the hanging vines," said Elle. "I don't remember any of this," said Walt. "We're lost." "We're not lost," said Lynn. On the left side of them, they passed a young girl, standing naked by the trail. Her eyes caught spectral in the headlights. And they came into the sleepy town. Smoke rose from the smoldered pits. None of the windows had light behind them. But the people were standing in places that they'd been standing in before. The men by the tree rose their whiskey bottles and cheered. The women scowled and blew sarcastic kisses off their cigarettes. The fiddle player kicked the fire and tore his bow across the strings, shrouded in sparks, the devil's dance. Lynn took the path they'd entered in through earlier, passing another child on the right, sitting unoccupied, on a stump, picking at his teeth with a gray rib bone. And none felt relief until they came down the hill and saw the lights of the RVs, like established civilization in the distance. They came into the camp, where several men were meandering still, and some sat around fires with marshmallows, large men in overalls, wearing trucker hats, clapping hands and raising fists. These men laughed at the car as it went by, cheersing with their beer cans high in the air, suds flying. Another duped intruder chased out from their home. Lynn took her speed higher on the way out than on her way in. And in the field behind the large hand-painted sign, Walt saw the house he hadn't been able to see before, a small ranch with plastic siding, something blending perfectly into the landscape so as not to be noticed, even here. Behind it, in the backyard, the golf cart and its light wound around in circles, high up on the slope. The trio didn't speak until they were on the highway, and even then, they didn't know what to say. "I left my tent there," said Elle. We could go back, Walt suggested. Do you think he wanted us to keep the radio on in order to drain the battery out? Do you think he planned on this from the start? I don't know, said Walt. Right now, I couldn't say. I wonder if he'll remember this in the morning. Where are we going to stay? Asked Lynn, stoic. Where will we find a room at this hour? Walt called several places in Du Bois, and he found a hotel willing to take their money. The stretch of the highway between the two exits was long and empty. To kill the emptiness, Lynn turned up the radio, but hearing only static, she pressed the scan button, and then they all forgot that she'd pressed it. They stared at the road, watching the yellow lines jump forward at them as the station changed from shade of static to shade of static, then from genre to genre, then from program to program. Walt tried counting the reflectors on the side of the road and lost count before he even began. They checked into the room. It was basic and clean enough, with 2 beds. Lynn took one, and Walt and Elle took the other. But despite the close quarters, Walt felt far from Elle on the bed. He felt she was closer to Lynn's side of the room, and would remain there without him. He fell asleep, feeling exposed and discarded, and woke later in the night without blankets. He walked into the bathroom, full of fluorescent lighting and mirrors, and he stood in place on the cold tile. In the mirror, he saw a dark figure standing behind him. The figure was taller than him, shrouded with a cloak or blurred from existence, but there. Even in a hotel bathroom, one is an intruder. Everywhere in this land. It isn't wise to expect the dawn, so light your fires and see through night. What stories will you tell?